Good afternoon, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to deliver the PP Gomathi Education Trust Memorial Lecture for 2024. It's a great honor, and in fact, when I was called, I had the invitation from somebody who knew me from the time I was 16, 17, and I had just started. I had attended a meeting of the CPI, and CPI is very interesting because, at least in Tamil Nadu, they used to do a lot of work on attracting youngsters. Like, how do you get young people to, leftist politics? So, this was a week-long exhibition on Che Guevara, Cuba, everything. So, I was like a 16, 17-year-old who went there. So somebody from that party called me and spoke to me after at least 20 years, and he said, my friends in Mangaluru want your number, can I share the number? So I felt, okay, this is like coming a full circle, and then I said, yes, I'm going to go. There's a reason why I'm not very particular about Mangaluru. I was married into the city and I had a very rough time. So it's not my first choice of place to go. I actually always think I should avoid Mangaluru. It's very triggering for me. Then I also think that sometimes in life you need happy memories to replace tragic memories. So yes, thank you for the welcome and thank you for having me here. The thing is, I want to come back to the lecture topic and why I choose to talk about writing as resistance. So the first thing is, when you're speaking from Karnataka, when you're speaking from this very specific land, I think there are two writers who have been assassinated for what they think. And that's not a small price to pay. So when think about writing and resistance in Karnataka, the thing is, you immediately go to M.M. Kalburgi, who was a writer, academic, vice chancellor of the Kannada University in Hampi, and also journalist Gauri Lankesh, who was shot dead in her house in Bangalore. And this tells you a lot of things, because on the one hand, the southern states, whether it's Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, we generally like to believe we are very progressive. We generally have a certain self-definition, we have a certain outlook. But it's not a small coincidence that, some of this kind of assassination actually takes place in what's quote-unquote the Dravidian land, or what's quote-unquote the south of the country. And trying to prepare for this speech that I have been doing, over the last 2-3 weeks since I confirmed the date, one of the images that actually came to my mind is that in August 2015, after Kalburgi's assassination, there is this protest meeting or condolence meeting organized for his assassination. And there's a very stark image. And that image is like, I think, a Hindu photograph, and there are 3 writers sitting there protesting. And so the first writer is Gauri Lankesh. The second next to her is Marula Siddhappa, and next to her is Girish Karnad. And it really, you look at that image in August 2015, and there is no foreshadowing, there is no premonition, there is no knowing beforehand that the next on that list of targets is going to be Gauri Lankesh. And 2 years later, she herself, is assassinated, and that too on the doorstep of her own house. And it's almost like, when you're a writer in this country, and especially when you're a writer who says unpleasant things, who says things that people don't want to hear, that people don't like to hear, things that are, critical of the system, then it's almost like a relay race, There's somebody who is running, there's somebody who is doing this really activist loud stuff, and then that person gets taken out, then the next person gets taken out. So what I want to come back to, and what I want all of us to think about, is that we are writing in a land where you pay for your words with blood. And this is not a prehistory. We are not saying this happened 4,000 years ago. We are not saying this happened in, Sangam era. We are not saying this happened during the time of the Bhakti literature. We are not saying this happened, during the wars between Shaivism and Vaishnavism. This is happening now. This is happening today. It's happening in our day and our time. And so the second thing is, we talked about writers who are killed. The second, and this is not far removed. And the second thing you come back to and want to talk about is, I want to think of 4 books that are, released either in 2013 or released in 2014. So one of the book is Varavara Rao's book of poetry, a collection of his lifetime of poetry. And now Varavara Rao has this singular exception of being the only Indian writer to have spent at least like 20 years or more in jail throughout his life. He's more than 80 years old now, but this huge amount of his life was spent in prison. And the other book that came out was G.N. Sai Baba's Why Do You Fear My Way So Much? And Sai Baba, of course, passed away recently. He passed away actually on the day I turned 40. It was like the worst birthday in that sense. But for me, Sai Baba was again spent 10 years, in most of them in solitary confinement, again in prison. The third writer, whose book again I read and I kept reading yesterday, was Sudha Bharadwaj. So she has written Fancy Yard, which is about, death row prisoners she encountered. And the fourth book that's come out last week is Anand Teltumde's critical biography of Dr. Ambedkar, and it's called Iconoclast. And now why do I want to, point out these books? All of them in some way are prisoners connected to the Bhima Koregaon case, with the exception of G.N. Sai Baba. And in 2018, the year 6 or 7 months after Gauri Lankesh's assassination, more than 16 writers are again jailed on trumped up charges. Writers, intellectuals, artists, activists, lawyers, thinkers. And the case is yet to come to trial, and this has been like 6 years, 5 years later. And so some of the writing that's being forged in India today, it's not the writing that you just see at festivals, it's not just the writing that you see in your newspapers, but it's also the writing that's forged in India's prisons. And this is something that, again, we have to look and think back. What does it tell you about our country if the defining poetry of our time and the kind of radical biography, the kind of most important political commentary that comes out of our country is being written from inside prison? So, and this is where I also want to, go back and ask, or, think through or think with you on what is the framework for this? How has it happened that, writers are killed, A, or writers are B, in prison? So, for instance, with G.N. Sai Baba, he's given bail by the lower court. Then the Supreme Court sits on a Saturday and they deny bail to him. And what they say orally is that they say, even if he has not done anything physically, because he's a 90% disabled professor, they say the brains are most dangerous. This is their exact words of the court. And then the same logic, the idea that the brain is dangerous, it's also what I think at some point our own Prime Minister said, that we will fight every form of Naxalism, be it the one with guns or the one with pens. And this is, it sounds like a rhyme, it sounds like, a flourish of speech, but it's a very interesting usage. It's like the kind of thing that you really have to underline and think about it, because you just don't want to let it go. You want to circle around, you want to stay with it and think, because what is happening when pens and guns are equated? Because this is not it's not an easy conflation, because what I think happens, this conflation between the figure of the writer and the figure of the gun-toting fighter, it works in a very dangerous manner. Because first, it allows the state to hunt down writers. And, by writers, I also extend this to intellectuals, artists, dissidents, basically anyone who works at the realm of thought. In the same manner, and they can be hunted down, writers can be hunted down in the same manner in which the state is hunting down fighters. And the second thing, this is where we also see the crystallization of what the right-wing regime has arrived at, this idea of the urban Naxal. So what they call urban Naxal, you do not have to bear arms, you do not have to hide in the forest, and even if you're out in the open, you will be hunted down in broad daylight, and you will be considered, quote unquote, a terrorist. And what do we know is that once this language of terror is used against anybody, then anything can be done. It's somehow, the means justify the ends. We know this story, and we know how this story is going to end inevitably, because when the word terrorism is used against nations, they are bombed. When the word terrorism is used against liberation movements, they're decimated, destroyed, and wiped out. And when the word terrorism is used against individuals, they're locked up. So this attempted conflation, the saying people with guns and people with pens, I think this is what the UAPA in some ways did, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is it kind of opened the doors and started to say that an individual, to be considered a terrorist, does not have to belong to any prescribed organization. And again, this is quite interesting because in trying to isolate the individual, something very interesting is happening around the idea of terror, but also against the idea of expression in this country. Because, when I grew up, I think the most problematic law at that time was the Prevention of Terrorism Act, called the POTA. But India has a long history of anti-terror laws. So you had the MISA, you had TADA, Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act. You also had POTA, prevention. But the thing is, when these acts were used, whether it was MISA, whether it was TADA, whether it was POTA, it was always also used against politicians. So in Tamil Nadu, MP like Vaiko was locked up. You had very senior political figures like Stalin himself, our chief minister, was himself jailed under MISA for some point. So leaders were, going to prison under TADA. So the thing is, because these acts were used against political parties, the strength of these parties, especially their ability to mobilize at short notice, led to anti-terror law, protests against anti-terror law becoming mass movements. So in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, you actually had mass movements saying no to POTA. People could come on the streets, gather in large numbers and fight. But today what has happened in this, neoliberal evolution and a turn towards the right, is that politicians are controlled not by anti-terror laws, they're controlled by the ED and they're controlled by the CBI. So this idea of how do you trap, once you leave politicians out of it, the UAPA becomes something only to challenge writers and intellectuals. And because of this demarcation is the reason why the fact that, 16 intellectuals are jailed, the fact that Father Stan Swami died without the court even giving him a sipper or a straw, all of this becomes possible because they are isolated as individuals. It does not, the fight for the release of the Bhima Koregaon of 16, the fight for, saying that they are actually innocent, this has not transformed into a mass public civil movement. And this is partly, I think, one of the reasons. And then again, what else does this achieve? Because, it's very easy to say, okay, I'm writing against resistance, I want to write. But what is it that is happening, and why is it that, writing as resistance, how is it being, prevented as a system? Because one of the things is that when you start calling everybody, you're urban Naxal, you're urban Naxal, you're urban Naxal, somebody says, please talk louder, I'm like, you're an urban Naxal. Somebody says, I disagree with you, you're an urban Naxal. Somebody says, I did not vote for this party, you're an urban Naxal. So what happens when you just give this label of urban Naxal to everybody, and especially to writers, journalists, dissidents? And I think is that writers at some point become extremely afraid of collectivizing. You do not want to act as a group, because the minute you act as a group, you can become a prescribed group. And the second thing is that writers become, in some way, victims of self-censorship. So you are afraid of being a dissident. And this has a very, it's okay if somebody was, if I was making food and I don't want to collectivize, if I was just cooking and I don't want to take a political stand, that is okay. In some way, I don't affect somebody else's life. But when it is a writer, it affects the body politic of the country, because people's movement, mass protest, grassroots resistance, collective action, civil disobedience, but also at the end, armed resistance, whatever is happening around the country, this loses an intellectual support base. Nobody is writing about these things. People may be reporting, people may be, writing whatever syndicated reports that come out, but this kind of engagement, this kind of intellectual support in which writers and thinkers come and say, okay, these people are leading the right struggle, these people are doing the right thing, that space is completely eroded. It just doesn't exist. And the question again is, And it's very easy, because what does neoliberalism also make us do? It says, but why should writers tell these stories? The people will tell their stories. You know, this very easy idea that's saying, who are you to say somebody's story? The people themselves will say the story, which on the one hand, which on the surface seems like a very clear-cut, genuine, honest argument. But the thing is, when people are burdened with, carrying on a protest, how do you also give them the additional burden that, okay, but it's also your duty to write about it? And so and the question is that we come back to who will tell these stories, who will chronicle these struggles, and who will offer ideological clarity. So you can say, what's common now, saying the people themselves, but being burdened with the protest already, and also facing state brutality for being protesters, tasking them with the burden of also being witness bearers in addition to being revolutionaries. It means that the writer has absolved themselves of any role in society. It means the writer says, I'm going to throw my hands up, it's not my job, you're protesting, you go, you write your story. So what does the writer exist for? And this question of, what does the writer exist for also becomes a very existential question, because if you are being atomized in this manner, if you're being silenced in this manner, if you're being divorced from people's realities, in which you do not write about it, you do not engage with it, you do not go to sites of struggle, you do not sit with people, you don't read to people, you don't engage with people. Once you become this thoroughly cut off from people, it limits your experience, it limits the world you inhabit, and then you can only write about your own alienation. You can only write about the shameful silences that you inhabit. And you can also write maybe about, how carefully you're avoiding trying to get on the wrong side of, power, on the wrong side of the regime, on the wrong side of whatever law that exists. And when I wanted to think a lot about, writing as resistance, one of the things I also thought about was that in this country at this point, even reading is resistance. So a lot of people who were picked up under UAPA were picked up, and then they had to frame charges, and one of the only charges they could frame was they found problematic books in people's house. And what are the problematic books they're talking about? The problematic book was like, some book about the state and revolution or something, like some books by Lenin, some book by Marx. So just the mere fact that you could read, that itself is, is brought into this problem. And in this atmosphere, what else is happening to this idea of the urban exile? I mean, for an outside person, for somebody coming to this lecture, they'll be like, but why is she obsessed with, urban exile? But the reason for obsession is whenever writers speak out, especially in the last 5 years, is that whenever you speak out, that's exactly how you're shut down. You see, people just label you, this person is an urban exile. And so what else does it, why does this labeling exist, and how else does it serve a purpose, is that it's a very dangerous situation, because the burden of proof is on you. So if you have to prove that you're not dangerous, and if you have to prove that you're not in cahoots with the actual exiles, so the urban exile cannot actually engage in anything related to people, because they're busy in the task of supplying proof of their innocence. They have to say every day, no, I'm innocent, I have not written anything, I have not tweeted anything, this is not what I meant, I'm not going to engage politically, I'm this very neutral person. So in this state of atomization and the splintering of the collective, where we also, undergoing profound alienation, how do we organize an opposition? So how do we express ourselves? Because you just cannot die in silence. So, and this is where I think that, these are the heavy questions that lie down on me, or, vex me when I think about the act of, writing as resistance, because it's one thing to write, but it's another thing altogether to send those words into the world. It's another thing altogether to anticipate what happens when you send your words into the world. And also, when we think about writing the resistance, or writing as resistance, the natural question or the natural corollary is to say, who is writing the resistance? Because there are a lot of resistance movements happening in the country. And for instance, you look at, a few years ago, you had the farmers' protest. In Tamil Nadu, you have a lot of, recently we had Samsung workers protesting for union rights. You have protests everywhere. And this is like in Kerala, there's this huge amount of protests that, I happen to witness and participate in, where the coastal, villages of Chellanam are, like asking for the government to take care of them, to not give their land to the big corporates. So there is so much resistance happening in the country, but then again the question is, how do writers actually engage with it? As given that the individual to terrorist pipeline is so clear, and every artist, even with an anarchist tendency, is easily scapegoated. And so this is where I kind of want to wind up what I have been speaking about and open up for questions. I don't want to go longer than this. So it's a very interesting journey for me, especially to be a writer, because I have worked with Varavara Rao's work and compiled them into a book. When G.N. Sai Baba's work was published, I wrote the foreword to his book, I edited his poetry, submitted it to publishers, and then I went and met him in Delhi as well. So again, and I ran signature campaigns when these writers were arrested under the Bhima Koregaon case, trying to get them out of jail and trying to get, publicity around the case. But when this kind of thing is happening, you are constantly second-guessing yourself. You're thinking, okay, so this is happening to my friends, and then every day the circle is shrinking. It's happening to someone you know, and then it's happening to someone you know better than that, like someone more closer to you. And so when you live and inhabit this shrinking circle, you yourself are, I wouldn't say fear, but you're living with this extreme awareness that anything can happen to you. So in my own writing, I think my book of poetry came out this year, and I think I gave it the title, Tomorrow Someone Will Arrest You. And part of the reason that title was given was because that's exactly how it feels to inhabit a place where you cannot express yourself. And if you express yourself, because I express myself, knowing that there are consequences, and the consequences are like, it's not even like you have to give a provocative speech. As what is happening right now is, let's take the case of Mohammed Zubair, who is basically somebody who's checking facts and who was highlighting what happened in a hate speech somewhere. Just the fact that somebody highlighted a hate speech, they get a case against them for threatening India's sovereignty. So that's the bizarre extreme to which you have gone. Somebody who basically fact checks people, somebody who is doing a social service of trying to point out what is hate speech happening in our country, is now exposed to the brutal power. So I think we are operating in very difficult circumstances, to say the least. And therefore, it's on the one hand not easy, but on the other hand, it's an unavoidable journey. It's something that you cannot run away from, you cannot escape from, because you still believe in what this country means to you. You still believe in, the Constitution, or you believe in its preamble, and you believe that, this is what it means. You believe in unity. And so to write is, I think, the critics will call you anti-national, but I think at this point, the people who say the truth, the people who are actually fighting against these powers, the writers, the activists, thinkers, bloggers, fact-checkers, whoever is, highlighting these things, they are in fact the most patriotic people that, we can imagine living at this point. So I will just end on this note, and Sindhu told me we may have questions, so if there are questions, I'll take them. Thank you.
Mangalorean connections, and I'm so proud to call you a sister. Thank you. Because what Meena has done today is something very exceptional. She has come to a town where people don't like to hear things and spoken the truth. And I would request all of you to ask her why she speaks the truth as a woman, how it is recorded in our society, and why it is important for us to hear uncomfortable truths. I'm standing here, just like Meena stood here, after 24 hours of horror. I was supposed to come on a bus last night from Bangalore to Mangalore. I don't want to make it about me. It was the most horrific episode ever. When I actually went to a police station and the police turned around against me. So when Meena writes about resistance, she's writing about stories like what happened to people like me last night. We are supposedly the educated, empowered women of this country. If it can happen to us, it can happen to anybody. And that is why people like Meena write. They write so that the stories of those who don't have resources and voices are heard. I was fortunate to be able to take a flight today, thanks to my family here, and they know who they are. But last night when I sat in a police station, I was told, what is a woman like you doing at the middle of the night when my bus operator had offloaded me because he did not have the right bus for me? So I would request everyone to just reflect on that. Not on that, but why that is why Meena writes the way she writes. And why Meena's voice is so important. And why people like Meena should be read, heard, and listened to more. And we should engage with them more. Because this country, frankly, if we don't own up to it, it's not going to own up to us. And like they say, no one's going to come and save you if you don't stand up. So please engage with Meena. Please engage with people like them. Please speak up. Engage. Talk. And let's make this a nicer place for all of us to live together. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to it's a kind of conversation that I want to have with you. I think there are many ways of writing resistance. Mohammad Zubair is also writing resistance by dismantling the fictions of the regime, yes, and that the regime finds very threatening because it would like to make that fiction the truth, yes. The other way of writing is within the terms of the regime itself. So you're directly questioning what the regime is saying, you're taking an oppositional stance, and that too the regime does not like, and therefore the extreme step it can take you is to kill you. The other is to go astray of the regime, to write outside it, and to write against the common sense of the regime. And that cannot be understood. Yes, nobody understands it except maybe the very few, and that too becomes meaningless. Yes. So the problem, we can't keep silence, that is true. We have to speak. But the question is, how do we speak? Yes, it becomes very, very troubling, and there are no public spheres where speech is accommodated. When you're too radical, it is not accommodated. So how do you reach out? Yes. And the spheres of dissemination of thinking and speech are also foreclosed to your kind of speech. So how do you write resistance?
No, I broadly agree with you in the fact that, Mohammed, that's why I mentioned Zubair. The reason I brought up Zubair is, for me, Zubair is as important to the narrative of Indian writing as anybody else. Because what Zubair is doing and the way he's punished for it is literally a writer's job. You may call him a fact checker, you may call him a lot of things, but acting as a conscience of the country, acting as, the truth teller, or rather the guy who rips off the face of those who lie, I think that's an amazing job. There's no second question about it. But this idea, and this is where I think we have to have a broader question, broader engagement, is that it's like recently, you had the US elections, and the Democrats tried to be like the Republicans. They tried to appeal to the common sense of the right. And what happens when you appeal to the common sense of the regime? When you appeal to the common sense of the regime, people are never going to vote for regime light. People are never going to vote for what is, the paler version of something. People will always want the original stuff. So you can be Republican, right? They don't want you, they'll reject you. So if you're trying in some way to appeal to majoritarianism and, to hatred, and you want to be, the light version of the regime here, I don't think it's going to work. Because people will want the original. So what we should do as writers is, even if you are very radical, that we push the radical edge. Because I think that's the whole thing, isn't it? That's what the Overton window talks about, or whatever it is. Like, once you have a critical mass of people who think in a different way, then you can shift public opinion that way. So I don't think giving up radical politics for convenient liberalism is the answer, at least not for me. So
I'm from Mangaluru, and the whole Hindutva outfit comes as a package deal. People like your Sri Sri, this man Jaggi. Yeah, his name is.
So what does it mean, sir? You are Sri Sri. How is my Sri Sri, sir?
I said,
he has office in Bangalore, sir. He is for you are Sri Sri only.
Like you means I meant it in the common sense. That's all. Because they come as a package deal, and once you start opposing them, the whole regime conspires against you. That's my personal experience as a speaker against these people, as a person who has taken on these people. And I was on the Sanatan Samstha hit list, far ahead of Gauri in that hit list. And I survived the attempt only because of my quick reflexes. And when Gauri murder was being investigated, there was a list of 4 people. And Girish Karnad, Bhagwan, myself and Narendra Naik and Niduvamidi Matswamy, 4 of us were on that hit list. So what I mean is, whichever voice that is raised against the regime, which comes as a package deal of all these people who support this Gomutra or this yoga and whatever nonsense they bring about, is considered as their enemy, and they take every step possible to eliminate it. I was under police protection up to April 23, and even that was removed by the BJP government. And the Congress government said that they'll restore it once we come back to power, and it has not been done. It's not that I asked for it.
Sir, I think you should get your protection back, sir.
No, I don't. I just don't bother. I've been doing what I've been doing, and I've been on the hit list since long. So it just doesn't matter to me. Maybe if I'm get off the list, it may matter to me, because that means that we are not making enough of an impact. So what I feel is the resistance of the Mangalurian is dead. That's what I feel. Because I've taken up enough number of cases, including that of an RTI activist, Vinayak Baliga, who was murdered by his own partymen because he exposed things happening in the temple and the Kashmir. So, and the people have made a hero of the murder accused and the gang. So this is the sort of situation we are facing in Mangalore today. And even the places where we were welcome to speak, we are no longer united. Because I've been in the field for nearly 40 years, talking about scientific temper, speaking against all these voices of irrationalism, including we got an episode removed from KBC of Amitabh Bachchan supporting something like blindfolded reading. And that's supported by the present regime, that children can see blindfolded. Even such stupid things are being supported by this regime. So I see a very bleak thing ahead of us. But of course, our voices will be there. We'll keep on raising them as long as we are alive. Narendra Dabalkar was my vice president. I am the president of Federation of Indian Rationalist Association. And all of us, we have been in common platform many times. Gauri as well as Kalburgi. But what I see is there is no support for resistance from the common man, or even if the support is there, it's a very weak voice coming just from the background and say, too bad. That's it.
So, I just, there's no question, but I do want to come back with some, sharing my own ideas on this. Thank you for enlightening all of us about what's happening, and salute to your courage. But this is some of the things I actually was trying to say is that for some reason, using these very strong instruments like ED and CBI, they have managed to neutralize the opposition. There's never been a more neutralized opposition in the history of India. Even 15, 20 years ago, you had the opposition on the street for what used to be radical protests. Now the opposition is so frightened about taking a stand, and because parties have huge numbers, it affects mobilization, it affects policy, it affects the space for, where you express. And also I think the capture of media, right? Like the space for media to, the space for any critical thought is reduced and reduced and reduced. And it's reduced to such an extremity that, at some point you're like, okay, if I'm writing on Twitter, that's all the audience I'm going to get, and possibly there's going to be a bigger audience than, writing in a paper. So it's that kind of, both self-censorship, but also a lot of these editorial lines are like that. And the third thing I just wanted to tell you is that, I don't know much about, Mangalore as a city. I lived here 12 years ago. But what I do know is that I visited during Udupi during the protests, right, for the women's right to wear the hijab. And then what I felt was that at that time, again, I felt it was a failure of India's intellectuals, in my opinion, because if you have to stand by, women's rights to do what they want. And then I think there's again this very liberal class which comes and says, this is not Hindutva. It's the liberal, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. So the idea is that, but these girls, do they want education or do they want emancipation? Deciding on behalf of the girls what it is to be emancipated. And then I believe that this could have been there are, I don't know, let's say, anywhere else in the country, you have 75% Hindu students attending. All colleges need speakers from outside, you employ people. If everybody in the supply chain, Hindu students, the Hindu classmates actually, the Hindu teachers, all of them took a stand saying, this is wrong, we will not come to class, this problem would have been solved in 2 days, And then I felt that will is lacking, that will to collectively do something is absolutely lacking, and this we're not doing enough, I think, empathy at all, and I feel that's very sad.
Yeah, it's very sad. And one man, he's a professor of philosophy in Barcelona University. His name is Jacob Koopman. He came to Karnataka, and he wanted to interview the change in the scenario after the assassination of Kalburgi and Lankesh. And quite a few people who were on the waiting list. Of course, I was on the confirmed list. There were people on the waiting list. They were not even willing to speak to him. They didn't even give him an interview. So this is the sort of state we have come to today because of the silence of the so-called silent majority. That's what I'm feeling. Being a very vocal person, I just can't be silent. But what I feel is, most of our people, I use a word in Kannada called as Narasattavaru. That is, the people whose nervous system is dead. So this is what I am telling about. People have always been listening to me. Those who are here,
Yeah.
so nothing new for them. It's only for them.
Yes, sir. I know you have a question. I think I'm going to just take a little over right now to kind of moderate the discussion so that we have more of a back and forth with Meena. Thank you, sir. Yes.
No, I'm not going to speak anything.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Well, a very simple question. One Meena Kandasamy here, one Meena Kandasamy there. Very few here and there. What do you see the future of writing as resistance?
Kind of couple of few questions. So that's one question about Meena Kandasamy here and Meena Kandasamy there, and where does she see as writing in resistance. Let's have a second question, sir, and then we can curate the questions and Meena can kind of like articulate her answers to them together.
My name is Harsha Kumar Kugwe. I am a journalist. I have one question. Before that, just I want to add something. You started your story from Kalburgi, but it was started bit earlier when our Jnanapita Awadi Anantmurthy was dead. He died. There was a celebration in Karnataka. Some people distributed sweets and they cheered up. And another thing was that before what we got to know from the Gauri Lankesh charge sheet was that it was before Gauri Lankesh was in the hit list, it was Narendra Naik. But in a change of plan, they shot Gauri Lankesh and it got a huge, notice from the state, and Sidramaya set up a SIT and all these things happened. Now at least that hit list and hitting is stopped because of the SIT. This is one, just I wanted
So
to
can
add.
we please have your
My
question? Thank you.
Yeah. You told that the circle, this writers circle, writers who are also resistors or fighters, this circle is shrinking. What do you think is the reason for this shrinking? And also, I want you to draw some attention towards the responsibility of universities or professors, all these things. Thank you.
So we have two questions so far. Meena, would you like to answer them or should we go another round?
It's quite an interesting question. No, I don't think it's about individual, like this or that person. I think we are all shaped by circumstances. And I always have, I think, two major, what do you call, like you have some moral compass, right? So my moral compass has always been that, you can be many things, right? You can be a rude person, you can be arrogant person, you can be spendthrift, you can be many things. But I think it's, my moral compass draws a line at being dishonest with myself. And this is just my personal, I have to be very honest with myself. So there are things that I just cannot do, like if I see something is wrong, then I'll have to say it's wrong. So I think one is that. But the other is also like, I remember when Gauri Lankesh was assassinated and, I was like, actually in my parents' house, and I remember somebody here said, yeah, your parents are PhD, so it must be easy to get a PhD. No, but actually my parents were very radical people. And because they were radical, I always tell my father, like if I'm going here and talking, or I talk in many places and I write a lot of stuff that comes for heavy criticism. And my dad is like, just go ahead and do it, just be bold and do it. And then you're like, this is quite interesting actually, because the second question is about universities. So for instance, I think in one of the colleges of Delhi University, I think they had prescribed my poems, and ABVP actually fought against that, and they wanted the poems to be removed. So they were organizing protests on campus. So when I go to these campuses, I'm like, sometimes I call my father and say, I'm going here. And my dad always says to me that, okay, what's the worst that can happen? Like, it's a very common sense conversation. What's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is that they can kill you. And then the second thing he says to me is that, well, if you actually die, then it means you have meaning in your death, because a lot of people die of a lot of things. They die of, diabetes. They may die of heart failure. They may die of X number of reasons. And if you actually die because of what you spoke, it means your death is very meaningful. It means you're speaking like a lot of, like really important stuff. So, and I think that, and that carries so much weight, right? Like, because all our life we are like, does our life have meaning? What's the purpose of my life? But then you're like in a very particular flux point where like, at least let my death have meaning. And I think once you conquer that fear, and this is where I think this writer and fighter conflation is also very important. Once you conquer that fear that, okay, they're going to take you out, they're going to put you in jail, I think the minute you conquer that fear, you can become actually very fearless. So, and I think a lot of people, and I don't think it's individual, I think a lot of people are eventually going to come to this point. Because the economic factors, the material reality of India is like, it's not hopeful for the young people. And in fact, today I was reading something that if you were born in 84 or before 84, 70% of this country was born after you. And that's like, you're already like really in the 30% older minority of this country, right? And do you think the 70% of young people are just going to sit through and, force themselves to suffer through whatever is going to come? I don't believe that. And second, I think that, sir made a very valid point about universities, which is, again, I want to answer this quite politically and also personally. So, my mother was a professor at IIT Madras, and my father was a professor of classical Tamil in Madras University. So, really very highly educated people. But what I remember is that 20 years ago, they were struggling for things like, Mandal Commission, reservation. Like reservation should be implemented in IITs. And at that time, when that happened, people used to think it's fringe. They used to be like, IITs are so big. How can you talk about reservation in an IIT? IITs produce the best students. How can you talk about reservation in IIT? IITs are about merit. How can you talk about reservation in IITs? So my mother, who, went to court, she was like a lower caste woman in the sciences. When she went to court, it was like, she was punished for it. For 18 years, she had this legal battle. But yesterday, I was actually checking internet, and the Congress spokesperson, Supriya Srinath, she had actually posted something saying 85% of IIT faculty are upper caste. And I was thinking, 20 years ago, this was such a fringe thought. If you said that, you were like seen in the margins, right? You were seen as, okay, one lower caste person with problems. But now it's become mainstream. It's like the Congress party saying we need a caste census. The Congress party, which is like the most centrist thing you can imagine, is saying IITs are dominated by people of one caste. And that change has happened. When you were fighting that battle 20 years ago, you would have felt alone, because I know how my mother felt. You would have felt like you were in the margins, and you would have felt like absolutely, decentered or, marginalized. Today it's become, one of the core arguments that the Congress party is using. So things change, and I think things always change towards the radical. Like today the Congress is saying, why are only upper caste sitting in IITs? It's a very evident question, right? So I think, coming back to universities, I think there's been a hijack for a very long time. And this hijack, I think at Sai Baba's memorial lecture, one of the things I said was, how much Sanatan do you think exists inside a temple, and how much Sanatan exists inside a university? I think the lesser Sanatanis are the priests in temples. I think there is lesser caste discrimination inside temples, It's just a very, because we think that Sanatan is about, who prays and all. But the real gatekeeping, the real control, the real humiliation, the ritual humiliation of Dalit people, women, Adivasis, the real physical and mental exploitation of Dalit, Adivasi, women, Bahujan happens in universities. In a way in which a temple priest can never do. A priest cannot humiliate you the same way and go home safely. He cannot do that day after day, but it happens in universities. And universities are everything about universities reflects Sanatan, reflect this caste hierarchy. They have separate quarters for servants. They still construct them in a way in which, the servant has to enter through the back door. You go to any university campus that has residential accommodation, this is how it's done. So, and universities again have the largest number of contract staff, and always the contract staff happen to be people where the majority of those employed are, Dalit or Bahujans. So all the Group D staff are always on contract. And the hostel staff are never allowed to unionize. So you go and see which is the living, breathing place of Sanatan. That's the university. Which is why I think, and this system, the minute you enter the system, the system tries to swallow you. You become a Rohit Vemula, right? Like the system tries to do its best to destroy you. So I think that, that this kind of talking about resistance also is very important, because as much as, writing is about thought, writing is about clarity of thinking, we also live in a culture where we privilege degrees, right? If you have a PhD, people treat you differently. So you also have to learn to speak in the language of academia. So universities become this force where you are forced to go through them in order to get the qualifications to talk about what caste-based, majoritarian, problematic things they are doing. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but I do really think that universities are a big battleground for all these clashes. Thank you.
Belong to the university, so I think I have to reply to you, Meena. Yes, I agree. There is, this kind of systemic, yes, maintaining of hierarchies. But I also think universities can be spaces of resistance, especially the classrooms of, I am an English teacher. And I think our classrooms allow us, I think it's the last space in this place. Yes. Yeah. So, civil conversations can take place there. And if it is a public universities, you have students from all classes and all castes, because there is 50% reservation, yes? And therefore, I think the conversations there can be really, radically dialogic, yes? And sometimes in my own class, I also allow them to speak in Kannada if they are more comfortable in Kannada. Especially we have a paper on gender and I say, okay, you can speak there. And, these are the safe spaces where we can talk about things. Outside my classroom, maybe I couldn't speak about all these things, yes? And my students are so amenable to those dialogues. They come from different locations and they bring the language of that location. So I would somewhere, kind of nuance what you're saying about the university and also contest that the university is one space where nothing, everything is, yeah. Yes, Vemula may be one instance. And it is, it's sometimes not even a struggle actually. You don't have to fight so much. The classroom is not a space where you have to fight for that space and fight for that dialogue. It happens. It does happen.
No, you are saying that I said something that I did not say. I did not say it's not a site of struggle. I said my mother herself was a professor who was struggling for 20 years. But what I'm saying is they are citadels of Brahmanism. And the closer we realize that, and this Brahmanism is it's not even like always apparent. Sometimes it's subconscious. Like when you tell me all the students of all backgrounds are there because of reservation, that shows that there is this subliminal Brahmanism, because people should be there without reservation also if it was an ideal country. So, you know what I mean? So the idea that students are there because of reservation leads to its own cesspools. Students should just be there, whether there's reservation or not. So all these levels of which, and this is again what I'm saying. I never said, I go to University of Hyderabad, I take part in all these protests for, HCU, take part in protests for Rohit Vemula, then does it mean it's not a campus where protest happens? It happens. I was fasting for 2 days when the Joint Action Committee for Rohit Vemula was actually making demands. So I was actually sitting and fasting with the young students. You can ask anybody on the JAC committee, where was I? I was reading poetry to the students. And when we had the Beef Festival in Osmania University, I was part of the number of students there. I'm not a student of Osmania, but I was eating beef with the students. And they had to take us in a CRPF van outside the campus because Hindutva students started throwing stones at us. I was 22 years old. I got rape threats. I got death threats. So I'm not saying universities are not centers, but what happens to intelligent people inside universities? What happens to Dalit Bahujans inside universities? What happens to IITs? IITs have the highest number of suicides of Dalit and Bahujan students. So I'm just highlighting that this is happening. So it's very poisonous to come and say, but universities are not, because I agree with you. I think that classrooms are spaces where this can happen, but also universities as a structure, as a system, are enforcing Brahmanism in a way in which even Brahmins who are religious Brahmins even religious Brahmins cannot enforce themselves like that. A religious Brahmin cannot say things that today a professor can say. A professor can say, I am intelligent because of my genes. I am intelligent because, my parents came from whatever. But today, I think that kind of, the way control. I mean, yes, 3 days ago, 4 days ago, Hindu had a one-page editorial on how research guides are exploiting students. So, I mean, this is a rampant problem. I mean, sexual exploitation of women, it started in universities. Me Too movement in India started in universities. Why does it happen in universities? So, I think that, we have to talk about, obviously, we are, I think, as English teachers, we always are at the last resort for dialogue. We are the last space for, honest conversations. We are the last space for any radical thinking. At the same time, I don't think we can erase what these spaces stand for and what they systematically, structurally represent. And yeah, trying to drag me into this is very painful, to having to defend to you, because you're not my professor here. You may be a professor to somebody else. Okay, thank you.
Ideally, yes, everyone should have access. But because that ideal situation is not there, we have reservations. That is what I'm saying. Yes, ideally, everyone should have access. I completely agree with you.
Hi, my name is Ismail. I'm a journalist. My question is, when you write resistance today, in today's social spectrum, it's most likely that you are going to labeled as urban Nexal, as you said. And those who are writing propaganda, they are portraying their work as resistance today. For example, someone who's writing a movie like Kashmir Files or the Kerala Files, they are portraying it as resistance. So, and they have a better audience and huge audience than what the people who are actually writing resistance have. So in this scenario, how do you think the actual resistance should reach larger audience? How can we do that? And how can we actually show resistance as resistance and propaganda as propaganda?
At some point, we have come to a deadlock about language, and we have come to a place where every word, no longer represents what it was meant to mean. Like, even say the word propaganda, for instance. Like, a lot of the initial origin of it, at least in the Leninist idea, was the Soviets that had, after the revolution. The idea of propaganda was to take communist ideas and to spread it. Propaganda was not a bad word for a very long time. Propaganda is, like what you do as propaganda is to actually go and say, okay, these are leftist ideas. And so people would say, okay, this is a propagandist pamphlet. I'm a propagandist. I'm somebody who takes an idea forward. So the word propaganda in and of itself is not a bad word. It comes from propagate, which is to spread an idea. But today propaganda becomes a bad word. You know what I mean? I mean, I am a propagandist. I'm a propagandist of leftist ideas. And propaganda is important because we are not doing propaganda enough. We're not saying, okay, communism is the answer. We're not saying, capitalism is bad. We're not saying neoliberalism is bad. I think once we start telling, truths honestly, what we do, we are evading that. We are evading that label of actually being propagandist, because if you really believe in something, you will be a propagandist, right? If I really believe this is the answer, then I'm going to say this is the answer. But what has happened is that in some ways, I think this, especially, we want to be slightly divorced from situations. We want to put ourselves at a remove. And because of that, we are like, okay, this is a neutral observation. This idea of the myth of neutrality, the idea that I'm actually removed from it. And because I'm removed from something, I can have a better perspective. I think that has fed into the system. So to answer your question that, we leave this word propaganda. I think people like Vivek Agnihotri, right? Yeah, the Kashmir Files guy. So I think one of the proudest moments of my life was actually Vivek Agnihotri saying she's an urban Naxal on Twitter. But then he also said something which is very revealing, is that he said she looks like someone who should sweep the red carpet. And I realized that it doesn't matter how famous you are, it doesn't matter how well-read you are, it doesn't matter, technically, quote-unquote, good-looking you are, that once it comes to a Brahmin to put you in your place, and especially for a Brahmin man, it's the easiest thing is to look at your looks, right? So, and to always to put you in the place of what is, according to the Chaturvarna system, your place. So you're a Shudra, which means you're supposed to be sweeping the red carpet. You realize where I'm coming from. And this, so I think this very poisonous guys, like how do you fight them, and how do you at this point again, I don't know if it was clever or if it was foolish or stupid, but recently I think it was possibly Modi who said in a speech that the Congress manifesto is prepared by Urban Naxal. He said it is an Urban Naxal manifesto, which is quite interesting because once you make the mainstream into Urban Naxal, lot more people will be like, oh, what's this Urban Naxal? Now it's almost like a joke. What was 5 or 6 years ago, this very, dangerous thing gets made into an absurd thing because it becomes that part of a mainstream. But how do you fight the likes of him? I think there's a lot of funding that goes into these systems, a lot of funding that goes into for him to, take about something called Kashmir Files, talk about quote-unquote genocide. And in one breath, he's trying to do two things. One is that it's basically rampant Islamophobia. The other is that it's apology for settler colonialism in Kashmir. And I think the third thing is it's also an apology, it's also basically catering to a lot of caste sentiments. Because when you talk about Kashmiris, it somehow gets diluted not even into Hindu, but becomes a Pandit issue. And therefore a caste issue. Like when you talk, it's a very coded language of saying, well, Brahmins were made to have an exodus. So this codification of what Agnihotri stands for, I think is hugely funded by their, I think what we have, one of the ways we fight it is to create alternative media to dispel this. The other way to fight it obviously is to, call him out on this kind of thing. But I don't know, I think all these Vivek Agnihotri types are going to be very short-lived, It's only so far that the Goebbels can work. At some point, people are going to call them out. I don't know, I believe in people's common sense at some point kicking in. So, thank you.